Okay, so we're on chapter 21. This is Goulder's interpretation of what Son of Man means versus Son of God. So I have this question at the end of our slides, but I thought maybe I'd start with asking you guys the question. In your viewpoint, when you read Son of God and Son of Man, what is the distinction that you've given of yourself over the years, if any? What do you think? Before Goulder told us his viewpoints.
Well, his viewpoints and the viewpoints of others.
And the viewpoints of others. I know. He rejected too.
Right.
I had to keep going, okay, Goulder doesn't like that one. Goulder doesn't like that one.
Yeah.
So yeah, you guys can correct me to see if I've interpreted Goulder correctly, but I just wanted to know what your opinions were of who is the Son of Man when you think of Jesus.
I guess I always thought we were all a son of man.
Okay. So in your mind, Son of Man was humanity. He represented humanity. Okay.
In my mind, it was lowercase.
It was lowercase. Okay.
Instead
Okay.
of uppercase.
Yeah, there's definitely that viewpoint. It is interesting.
Yeah. That's my opinion. I don't think you agree.
All right. Keep
After
the,
reading Goulder, well, I always thought of Son of Man, the way Jesus used it in the scriptures, was as a title.
yeah. Okay.
And generally was in reference or tied back to Daniel. But
Oh wow, you knew that's what you thought before Goulder came around. Good for you. I really didn't.
well, yeah, I mean
He does quote him. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he does quote
Like, oh.
Daniel, but now it's kind of like the way Goulder portrays it. I got confused with this chapter. We
Yeah.
talked about this a lot last time.
Yeah. I'm glad you guys did because you're gonna help me. There
We
were
didn't come to a conclusion.
there were times when I'm going, question mark?
So I don't know if some of those, after reading Goulder, I'm a little less sure that Jesus used that as a title about himself.
Okay. Well, then let's hear what we're gonna see what Goulder said, and then we'll come back to the question at the end. So Old Testament, the name Ben-Adam, is that how we say it? Paul's not
Well,
here.
not to me.
Ben-Adam means son of man, and it literally means in Hebrew male human being. So when we look at these are the scriptures that the Old Testament scriptures, hello Eloise, that come to mind when the Son of Man is first being talked about in the Old Testament. So Ezekiel says, prophesy to the wind, prophesy Son of Man. Psalm 8:4 says, what is man that thou art mindful of him, or the Son of Man that thou carest for him. And Psalm and Daniel are going to come up quite a bit in this chapter. So
Yeah, which just blows me. It all hangs on Psalm 8 and
Daniel 7. You know, and
Of
I
all
have
the
to,
stuff out there, we're
I
gonna
know.
pick those two and say you're
but
working on it.
Goulder is correct that the New Testament scriptures are taking it almost literally the
Yeah.
language, but even that is a little bit controversial. We'll get to
Yeah.
that. So Daniel 7:13 says, and behold, with the clouds of heaven came one like a son of man. So we're going to keep that in mind.
Question,
Okay.
because Goulder brings this up, looks it up, but have you capitalized the way those verses are quoted?
I did.
Because this.
Oh,
the second
man,
one
I
has
think I messed up man.
capitalized, but not son.
So I think I messed that one up. Yeah, I was deliberately
Otherwise,
making
we're all
sure
okay.
son was not capitalized. But I didn't make the same. I don't know. Somebody might want to look it up to see Ezekiel 37.
It's probably the
It's small. I
non-capitalized
think
version,
it's non. Yeah, I know the
The
son
Old
is non.
Testament.
Is
I don't think the
non-capitalized.
capitalization started until the New Testament. did it?
Exactly, and that's one of Goulder's points. Okay, so then we've got in Aramaic the words bar. I don't know how to pronounce this stuff. Bar Anash a son of man versus Bar Nashi, the son of man. And so Goulder talks about this Palestinian Talmud, a compendium of Jewish traditions that talk about the son of man in Aramaic in pretty much the same way that the Old Testament did. So this rabbi hid in a cave for 13 years. He came out at last and saw a bird escape the hunter's nest, and he said, "Not even a bird perishes without the will of heaven, how much less the Son of Man." And again, son is not capitalized, man is not capitalized. So we're talking about humanity, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
It just struck me that the New Testament scripture, about the sparrow, God watches over the sparrow, and I always wonder
Yeah.
if he's quoting that, or if the New Testament quoted him. He was later, Rabbi Simeon was later.
He's later. Yeah, he's
Yeah,
in the
okay.
first four. He's like, they weren't very sure, but
So
in the
the-
first 4 centuries.
Yeah, so that statement must have been.
Yeah. Well, I like
Later,
how
yeah.
Goulder talks about how, the New Testament authors are scholars of the Old Testament. I mean, they are scholars of the Torah. So it makes sense to me now that I think about it, that they are quoting what they've already read, so they knew Daniel very well. They knew Psalms very well. So this is a rabbi in, somewhere in that first century, once again using that language, son of man, because that's the language of the Old Testament. So that's, I think, what Goulder is trying to point out to us here. Okay, so here's theory number 1. So, Goulder doesn't really like most of the theories in this chapter, so I think I get to his theory at the end of the chapter. You guys you'll let me know. So theory number 1 is Son of Man equals Son of God. And he says, let me see if I've got it right here. Son of Man is used as a title. So foxes have holes, but the Son of Man, son is capitalized, has nowhere to lay his head. And that's Luke and Matthew saying that. And then Matthew and Mark say the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. And then John says, whereas the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son to have life in himself and has given him authority to execute judgment also, because he is the Son of Man, capital Son. So we got a title here. Title only belonged to Jesus. It is interchangeable with the Son of God. And that's why they're starting to capitalize Son of Man.
Well, and I didn't look this up, I should have Googled it, but the King James Version, that's kind of what we all think of, the
Mhm.
first version that a lot of people read.
Mm-hmm.
Did they choose what to capitalize and what not to capitalize? What were the capitalization English then? I mean, some of that does change over time.
Well, that's a good point. Are they the same rules that are in Aramaic and Greek?
Right.
And-
Well, there are
Oh.
capital letters in Greek, I believe.
Okay.
There's upper and lowercase letters. I don't
Okay.
think there are in
But-
Hebrew.
But
Okay.
how are they applied?
So the Old Testament,
Yeah.
you would have to know what the letters meant.
Yeah,
But in the New Testament, you would see if it's capitalized Greek, because
yeah.
you consider it capitalized.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Translations are always interesting.
Oh, yeah.
And you'll see Goulder mentions the translation problem later on here, but here are the 3 reasons why Goulder says the Pauline reject this theory. Okay. So we got the theory that the Son of Man, capital Son, is the title for Jesus. All right, so number 1, there's enough evidence from the Bible and the Jewish writings, this Talmud, that the Son of Man is really used as kind of a paraphrasing of like a bloke or a chap.
Well,
I was thinking in American we would call him a dude or a guy, So it's like, hey, come on, that's too common. That's not a title. Son of Man,
humanity.
humanity, exactly.
Hey, man. Come on,
Hey, man, yeah, exactly. I thought it was kind of cute that Goulder used the English versions of these. So it's like, all right, we know what he means. So, and then he says, Paul never used the phrase as Son of Man as a title. I had to go back and kind of figure out what he meant by this one. And neither do the other epistles. It's, Jesus is the only one who uses the phrase for himself. And in that way, and we'll see it later, Jesus is considering himself as humanity. So I think that's what Paul means
That's
there.
an interesting point.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
I wondered a little when I read that. I mean, the other alternative is that the authors applied it to Jesus because they're really the ones who were writing what Jesus said.
yeah,
You know,
I know. And he says later in the chapter, it's like, well, there weren't any Christians at the actual trial, for Pilate. And so whenever the four Gospels are talking about it, they're imagining. Goulder actually uses the word imagining. This is what Jesus said. So
Yeah.
it is confusing
Well,
to
and
me
then,
who
then this
decides on
whole-
the words.
This, I thought was a little strange. The whole thing with the capitalizations, Jesus would not say, "I am the Son of Man," capitalized, because he never wrote it, as far as
He
we
never
know.
wrote anything.
Yeah, as far as we know,
Well, and then he
didn't speak Greek. As far as
well,
we
and
know.
Jesus did say, at least in our scriptures, he did go back and forth between Son of Man and Son of God, which has always kind of confused me in my own interpretation. So what,
I don't know. To me, it just seemed like that ought to be more about the author than it would be about Jesus necessarily.
yeah,
But the one telling the story.
okay. I think you're right. I think Goulder's kind of projecting here.
Well, and by the way, Goulder is a local chap. He's from the University
Yeah.
of Birmingham.
There you go. That's
So-
right. That's right. I knew that. So then the third reason why Goulder rejects this Son of Man as purely a title for Jesus is because there was another book that existed at the time, and it was called The Parables of Enoch. And I have to tell you that I went back, because of course I know the Enoch story from our own tradition. So I'm thinking, the Parables of Enoch? I don't remember that. And it was, in fact, one of these heretical works that was rejected and not made a part of the original Bible. So I went back and looked at what Joseph Smith talked about Enoch, and he says that this, I'm not sure exactly where it is in our own scriptures now, but in the Mormon scriptures, it's in Genesis, Moses, which is in the Pearl of Great Price, and the Doctrine and Covenants. And I'm not sure where exactly. I think it's in our inspired version of
Yeah,
Genesis.
the inspired
Yes.
version of Genesis.
Is that right?
is the story.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Maybe,
But
maybe in the Doctrine and Covenants too. Is that
I think it is.
one
It's in
that's
both.
In both?
Yeah. And so what Joseph Smith said was, this is the original book of Enoch. So I don't know if I don't have no idea if Joseph Smith even knew what Goulder is talking about. But I just thought when I heard the name Enoch, I had to go look it up and confuse you guys more. That's what I wanted to do. So there you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So the book of Enoch this parable of Enoch used the phrases Son of Man as human figures in heaven. And so that's why Goulder is saying this was not a title just for Jesus. Okay, here's theory number 2. Son of Man means man in normal sense. And Goulder is rejecting this one also because it's too rarely used like this. So Mark says the Son of Man goes as is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. That's one time that it actually has been used. Man has general meaning that would have reference to the speaker. Goulder disagrees. Mostly in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Son of Man is used as a title by which Jesus referred to himself, not a general expression of mankind. For example, the Son of Man is coming. This is where Goulder confused me a little bit, because it seems to be used interchangeably sometimes. Is Jesus calling himself Son of Man as the title, that capital Son of Man, only equal to Son of God? Or is Jesus saying that he is, Son of Man, humanity? That's where we get confused. I mean,
I think he was ambidextrous to use them both ways.
that's kind of how I, I mean, if I ask myself the question of what I thought of Son of Man versus Son of God, I would actually agree with Sharon. I mean, Son of Man is pointing towards his humanity, but it still meant Jesus. And then Son of God is pointing towards his divinity. So,
Well, I think, and keeping in mind the bigger question, which is, was Jesus a human who was possessed of the divine, or was Jesus both human and divine?
right.
So I'm having trouble figuring out, well, is Son of Man capitalized? Is that the Pauline view? And Son of Man not capitalized is more the Jerusalem view?
Well, let's get to that question. I think that's next.
This was a harder chapter for me.
All right. So he sees Son of Man in the context of the Pauline versus Petrine battle. All right. So what Goulder is saying is that these New Testament authors went back to Psalms and went back to Daniel, as we'll see later. And so, for instance, in this one, the Psalm 8:4-6, that's really important in terms of comparing Son of Man from the Old Testament to the New Testament. So in Psalms, it says, "What is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you care for him? You made him a little lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor. You put everything in subjection under his feet." This language is almost used word for word in some of our New Testament scriptures. Okay, so when we go to Ephesians, which is, I mentioned this because in the next slide, Paul actually has a harsher view of who Jesus was versus the angels. But in this viewpoint, Paul isn't feeling threatened. He is more genial when he says that power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at the right hand in the heavenly realms. So this is about Christ is seated on the right hand of God, but there isn't necessarily a punishment element yet. So the harsher viewpoint that the Paulines have, according to Goulder, is it was contrasting to what the Petrines were keen on the activities of the angelic power. And remember, the Petrines and the Jerusalem Jews were thinking that Jesus was human until the dove came down, and that was the Spirit basically putting Christ onto Jesus. The Paulines reject that, and our history has rejected that, saying no, he was always human and he was always divine. And so Paul is proving this by saying, okay, let's go back to Psalm 11:1. The Lord says to my Lord. I think that is what it says. This one Lord is capitalized and one Lord isn't. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And then in 1 Corinthians, Paul uses very similar language when he's referring to Christ's resurrection, saying, then the end will come when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power, for he must reign until he put all his enemies under his feet. So that's the footstills to your feet, enemies under his feet. So that's this harshness that Paul is borrowing from the Psalm to say that's what the Psalm was referring to Christ. After his resurrection, he's going to have this power, this dominion over others.
Well, like a lot of Old Testament scriptures, they changed the interpretation from what the rabbis had always thought that meant, and then put it in the new context.
Well, and you think of who Matthew was. Matthew's whole job in the whole, chapter of Matthew was to prove that Jesus was the Messiah, because he was speaking to the Jewish people. It makes more sense to me when I think they really are trying to prove their case. Mm-hmm. That's why we have 4 different versions of these stories, is because these guys were talking to different people, Mark was talking to the Gentiles more. And Mark was obviously a follower of Paul, at least according to Goulder, and I can see those similarities. And then, Luke's kind of that in-between guy.
That's supposed to be Psalm 110. Just
Psalm
not that.
110-1.
Right.
Okay.
I like the little cartoon that's going around Facebook from time to time, and Jesus is talking to his disciples on the hill. And he says, now listen carefully. I don't want to hear 4 different versions of this later on.
It didn't work out so well for him. Okay. So the book of Hebrew calls Jesus fully human. So it is not to angels that he has subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking, but there is a place where someone has testified, what is mankind that you are mindful of them, a son of man that you care for him? You made them a little lower than the angels. You crowned them with glory and honor and put everything under their feet. That sound familiar? And we just, of course, I've got it wrong. That's again Psalm. So once again, we're talking about putting everything under them. God left nothing that is not subject to them. We see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while. That word little while is important. Now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death. So by the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. So here's the interesting thing about the translations. So Jesus is an eternal unity, is what the Paulines are saying. But Goulder says that it was almost an accident in translation, because in the Hebrew language, the word is a little lower, whenever they're talking about a little lower than the angels. But when you go to the Greek translation, Jesus is lower than the angels for a little while. So in the Pauline viewpoint, Jesus was an eternal being who was made for a little while lower than the angels. So it's almost like the Greek translation kind of expanded the definition of what little lower meant, as it was important for the Paulines to say that he was only human for a little while. And then according to the Pauline viewpoint, and of course the traditional Christian viewpoint, God could only have crowned him with glory in recognition of something he has done. And that is, of course, the cross. He tasted death for everyone. So in this way, Jesus is both a spirit and in some way human. But remember, he was just human for a little while. That was important for the Pauline.
I don't know the answer to this. Maybe somebody does, but where did this hierarchy of humans and angels and God, is that Jewish? Is that Old Testament? And then there's archangels in there somewhere. I think they're like the boss of the angels.
Yeah, I think the Old Testament talks about the hierarchy quite a bit.
Tradition.
Yeah.
Well, it's, in the Bible,
Michael the
angels
Archangel.
are, we don't know if they were people, if they had a human life, but certainly in the Book of Mormon, Moroni, the angel Moroni was a person. So apparently there's some movement from one level to another for some. I don't know. I never thought about it before.
Well, and I don't know. I have a little trouble with this chapter because I don't really think the Psalms were written to forecast the Messiah. When the psalmist is talking to God and says, what is man that thou art mindful of him? I see a person just petitioning him. We're so small, you are so great. Why do you even pay attention to us? We sin, it's psalms of that type. So what is man that thou art mindful? I don't think of it as referring to Jesus.
What is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou carest for him? Yeah, I thought that was interesting too, because now we've got we've got Mark referencing that psalm. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man, capitalized, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and then he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Jesus is destined to suffer death, but beyond that, he stands his rising again to glory. So that's the epitome of the Pauline viewpoint, is that was Jesus's destiny. And yes, he was fully human, but because he was destined for death, that was going to be kind of the final way of making him glorious, making him, a deity, making him a god. So Mark knows this, or at least he argues this, is my opinion, because it was foretold in Psalms. So yes, the New Testament authors were reading the Psalms differently. I do not know. I mean, nobody knows what the original Psalms writers meant. There's an argument that they were thinking of a Messiah, but there's also an argument that they were thinking of Jerusalem. At one point, there was a definition that they were talking about Jerusalem. So then we have Daniel's dream, and I went back and looked at this for that same reason. So Daniel 7:13 talks about it's kind of the end version of his dream, and he's saying that. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language and worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and this kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Later in Daniel, this scripture is explained to say the Son of Man was a symbol of the Jewish people in face of the beastly empires who was brought up to the divine throne with the clouds. So there's actually an interpretation of Daniel's dream in Daniel. And so that's why it's interesting then when Mark takes the Daniel verses, and this is where Goulder says, well, Christians weren't there. so Mark had to imagine what Jesus's words were to the Sanhedrin at the trial, which I thought was interesting that Goulder would say it that way. So in Mark 14, again, the high priest asked him, we all know this scripture, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? I am, said Jesus, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. And then he has combined Psalm 110, I got the number right this time, and Daniel by saying in Psalm, the words seated at the right hand were used. And in Daniel, the words Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven is used. So Mark, the scholar, let's just call them all scholars here, because they knew the Old Testament, was combining Psalms and David into imagining what Jesus said to the Sanhedrin. Once again, that makes sense when Mark is telling his people that Jesus was the Son of God. It's used interchangeably here in the same paragraph.
Yeah. I don't know if the capitalization is a big deal or not, but it's capitalized there, but in Daniel, it's not capitalized.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you like to have been present when the Sanhedrin got to heaven and saw Jesus sitting there?
It's interesting that passage from Daniel, how really kind of similar that is to the inspired version story of Enoch and the city of Zion that was taken up to heaven.
Yes.
And then he mentioned, Goulder did mention that book of Enoch that he referenced. Some people believe that Enoch was the Son of Man.
Well, and I went back and looked at the King James version of who Enoch was, and all it says is Enoch had many sons, and then Enoch was taken to heaven.
Yeah.
So the inspired version is an expansion of that story, but I had the same thought. It's like, our Enoch story is very similar to this. Fascinating.
And it
I
kind
used
of
to
goes
love-
with that being the Jewish people. Overcoming.
That's right.
Take-
Yeah, that's a
You know,
hopeful.
I just think it's neat that it's a group of people. It's
Mhm.
sons of men.
Mhm.
Yeah,
yeah.
Well, and
sons and
that's what,
daughters.
well, that's been our symbol of Zion forever and
Yeah.
ever, you know, I mean, I grew up in Sunday schools, learning about the Enoch going up to
Right.
heaven, and that's what we're trying to do, is to build Zion to go up to heaven. So it was almost, it was this image of a city in my mind,
Right.
you know, which is now kind of interesting when we compare what perhaps Mark thought about it versus, you know, what we think about it. I mean, this kind of opens the mind a little bit to who is this Son of Man? So Daniel continues to have an influence on Mark's language. Mark 8 says, if anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. And in Mark 13, at that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. So he's paraphrasing Daniel again. I do really wonder about translations,
Mhm.
you know, because if Mark was writing in Greek, was he translating himself from the Hebrew to the Greek? I don't know how that worked back then. Did all of them know Hebrew?
If he was Jewish, he probably did.
It's-
I mean,
And I'm
scholarly
the
enough to
same
write
way
a book.
with, the guys that sat there and decided who was gonna be in and who was gonna be out of the Bible. And then sat there and, hand wrote it over and over and over.
Yeah,
You know, what errors may have been
yeah, this one's in,
changed
yeah,
to the time, and
this one's in, this one's heresy, you know, it's an interest, I would have loved to be in that room, you know, for all those guys figuring that one out.
they can't even agree on some simple phrases, let alone the whole books.
Well, you know, we've said this before, but I'm actually glad that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are in the New Testament. I do think what we're learning now is that perhaps the reason why is because there were different viewpoints of who Jesus was, and it was important for the young Christian church to show all those viewpoints, you know, and then it's up to us to figure out how to.
Different groups had to champion their,
Yeah,
their
yeah.
choice.
Now, the Pauline viewpoint obviously won out. The book of John is the Pauline viewpoint, is Christianity over the years, you know, so that's very clear. But you can see glimpses of what Paul was talking about with the struggle with the patrines, which is interesting. All right. So Paulines are explaining, remember that Jesus's authority is above the law. So this is another distinction between the Paulines and the patrines. But using the word Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Remember, you got the whole Sabbath controversy. The Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. And the title of Son of Man comes 70 times in the gospel. I thought that was interesting. So I didn't look up how many times Son of God is in there, you know, because it's like, I've always been confused why they had to say both, you know.
The other thing to keep in mind is that, at this time and up until this time, people didn't have access to the Bible. So all they had was what they were told.
Yeah.
And they weren't allowed to look at the scriptures. That was only for the big guys. And they were given what was given by the guy that was in charge. So
Well, and I don't know when literacy became a common thing.
Yeah,
It was very uncommon for thousands of years.
it was important for these early writers, though, to use both phrases, Son of Man and Son of God.
Because they did.
Because they did, whether it was for themselves, for the priests to all read. But over the years, both the words Son of God and Son of Man have stayed in all of the translations. And so it's kind of up to us. So Goulder's trying to sum it up, which I got confused again. So to sum up, Jesus never used the title Son of Man for him of himself, unless if he said it, then he meant just a normal man,
So he used it lowercase.
lowercase, according to Goulder.
Okay.
Although Goulder earlier said they used it as a title. I got lost. in
I
that
know,
part.
me too. Okay, so then that's why in Goulder's viewpoint, Paul never uses the words Son of Man as a title. Son of Man did come in Psalms, and then Paul used it in Corinthians and then Ephesians to use the word Son of Man to speak of Christ's incarnation, death, and resurrection and victorious enthronement. So this is,
So he uses Psalms to
Paul.
explain his view.
yeah. And Paul is now saying Son of Man in the context of it has to be Christ's after the resurrection. And then Goulder says that these epistles open the door to Mark, and he says other evangelists. I assume Matthew, Mark, Luke.
Well, and maybe some others that didn't make
John.
it into
So Son of Man now appears as the title of a pre-existent human spiritual being. I wrote that down exactly how Goulder said it, who was made for a little while lower than the angels. So I keep coming back to Jesus was all human and all divine. And so if he has this title of a pre-existent human spiritual being, then the Pauline viewpoint, and quite frankly, the Christian viewpoint is he was a human while he was on earth. Well, I still say he was both human and divine on earth. I don't know. So I'm not sure if the Paulines agree with me. Is Goulder going to agree with me that says that he was both human and divine while on earth, or are the Paulines saying that he was human on earth for a little while, lower than the angels? See, this is where I'm confused. Anybody have an answer for me?
We'll have to ask him when we get there.
Ask Goulder.
I really think this is a theological issue down to the thousands of years that it's been discussed.
Yeah. Definitely Son of Man is used as a title for Christ. And definitely the words Son of Man are used for human, for men as humans. The big question, and I don't think Goulder's actually answering it for us, is how did Jesus see himself, and what was the reason for Son of Man versus Son of God in the New Testament? So that's my questions. Compare your own viewpoints before you read this chapter of Son of Man versus Son of God, and has it changed now? That's question number one for you guys.
Okay, so did Jesus ever use Son of God referring to himself?
Well, he answered the priest, are you the Son of the Blessed One? Yes. And I think whenever that whole,
And you will see the Son of Man.
right, then he says Son of Man. But then then in that exchange with Peter, he says, who do you say that I am? And in the book of John, it goes to the extent of he's the Christ.
I suspect that as time went by, Messiah or Christ became the preferred title for Jesus. But Jesus, while he was here on earth, used Son of Man, and it was known through, at least in the Jewish Christian group, that he used that, and they couldn't deny it. So they left it in there, but they didn't quite know what to do with it.
Interesting.
They couldn't take it out because they knew Jesus used it.
Well, what if Jesus was using it in the Jewish Old Testament way all along?
That's right.
Maybe he was.
Yeah, maybe he was. Maybe he was talking about, the return of Israel in its glory rather than specifically himself, because he was all about proclaiming God's kingdom. So that's kind of compatible with
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's true. Every
things that
parable,
they
every
said.
parable he gave was about how to get the kingdom of God, get to the kingdom of God. So that would actually make sense.
This is just two very different views. You have the Pauline view where Jesus is God eternal, has been eternally, and then comes down and sort of, I don't want to say gets a demotion, but he becomes human
For a little while.
For a little while,
Yeah.
and then returns back to his previous state. And the Petrines are saying just the opposite, that Jesus was human, who was elevated for a little while and then became human again at his death. It's, they're kind of polarized.
Well, and
Viewpoints.
because after his death, they were arguing so much about who he was. I mean, I agree with Dennis. They had to put both phrases in the Bible because that oral tradition said that's what he said. That's why Goulder is referring to it. Well, when Jesus was talking about himself, he was talking about himself as a human being. I don't know how Goulder comes up with that because that could be. Or maybe Jesus was thinking of himself as Son of God. We will never know because it's all these guys arguing. I mean, this is what's so fascinating about this book for me is that Goulder is pointing out that these early Christians are really trying to figure out and pinpoint who Jesus was, And
Well, and after his death, there was a lot of confusion.
there was no,
And
they didn't
people-
have a leader.
Yeah, and people were saying, who was this man?
Yeah,
And what was the meaning of his time with us?
yeah.
And why did he leave so soon?
Right. I mean, there were just many questions.
And it would make sense that the Jerusalem Christians, led by Peter and that group, kind of continued with the Jewish tradition of who Jesus was, versus Paul, who was the wasn't Sanhedrin. What was he? He was a
Pharisee.
he was a Pharisee. So here's this guy who was a Pharisee, and now he's been born again, basically, and he's going out to all these outer regions to explain who Jesus was to the Gentiles. So it's going to then lend itself to a different explanation about who you're talking to.
Well,
And I like
if-
his conclusion that, the explanation is, this two mission hypothesis, because there were two opposing groups, each saying that they had the truth about Jesus. And they're so opposite, and it does make sense if you look at it in that light, I guess.
Yeah,
If the Hollywood version that we've all grown up with of
And that is a
how the-
reliable source.
how the rabbis argued and were constantly, trying to interpret the scriptures, just arguing about what was right and what was wrong and
Well, they
according to
still
the
do.
scriptures.
Yep.
That was their tradition to question.
yeah.
And
It's
so
a great
maybe
thing for them.
maybe that was part of, maybe this questioning bit was part of their tradition that
Sure.
they haven't gotten away from as far as looking at Christ.
You're right, and it's not a bad thing.
Right.
I think our Jewish friends would say that to this day. And quite frankly, the lawyer
Yeah.
says the same thing.
Right.
I do not understand why people aren't willing to argue about these points. To me, it's like, why not? Let's talk about it. Let's figure out what your viewpoint is versus my viewpoint. Maybe we'll agree and maybe we'll disagree. Maybe we'll end up confused.
But did you, I mean, from the Petrine side, to me, it's like when Paul comes along saying who Jesus is, they're saying, hey, we walked with the guy. We listened to him. You weren't there.
Yeah,
Now
yeah,
you're telling us that we don't know who he was
right.
and understand him. You're the one who understands him.
Yeah.
I would have a big problem with it. Paul coming and telling me I didn't understand it when I was with him
But they
for 3
didn't.
years.
I mean, but they didn't. There were a lot of times they didn't understand, you know.
Well,
he
that's
was-
the way they're portrayed by the
Right.
Pauline.
Right.
Well, that's because
You don't hear the
he shook,
Petrine side really.
he shook their traditions too. And,
Paul did?
yeah,
Yeah.
so, Jesus did, because
Yeah.
Jesus came along and says, hey, you don't do these sacrifices, you don't do these other things that you've been brought
Yeah.
up to do. And so that shook their whole understanding of what their life was and what their understanding of how they were to communicate with God. And so that was a big shakeup to all of these, the non-Gentile. To the non-Gentiles. The Gentiles had a little different because they didn't have that same mindset and that same tradition of what they had to do and all these rules that they had to live by, as far as, you have to go wash on this and that, and you have to do, you can't do this on Sunday, you can't do that on. The Gentiles didn't have that.
Right. That's why Goulder says often that Paul kind of had an easier job of explaining who Jesus was because he wasn't tied to the Jewish tradition. But you got to remember that, it was at least 50 years after his death and resurrection that anybody wrote anything down.
Right.
So you think about oral traditions for 50 years, and then somebody says, okay, let's start writing this down.
Yeah, how easy would it be to write down what you did in 1972?
Exactly. Even if somebody told the
Or what
story,
somebody said.
I was just talking to a friend the other day. Oh, in fact, my sister and I were talking is that, her son is convinced that he's been in an air balloon because when he was 7, Johanna told him the story of her being in this air balloon. And so Connor has decided, because he was only 7 when he heard the story, he's decided that he was in it. So it's interesting to me that here we are 30 years later and he's still a little confused.
Haven't you always said as an attorney, when you're taking testimony from witnesses, they all have a different version of
Oh, yes.
what they thought they saw or heard?
Well, and I had that, unfortunately, I had that experience firsthand when I witnessed an accident. And then I'm trying to tell the police officer what happened. I had no idea. I saw it happen. And I couldn't explain it very well. I thought I was like so proud of myself that I was going to be this good Samaritan witness. And then the guys asked me, what did you see? Well, they crashed. Seriously, no one called me to be a witness. No one. So I'm thinking, okay, that was a real lesson for me as a lawyer. It's like, yeah, every witness is going to see it differently. Every witness is going to tell a different story. And then 50 years later, why are we not surprised that they were confused?
Even though life was slower then, it is still a lot of time passed.
A lot of time passed.
The other thing is that Jesus wasn't who a lot of them were expecting the Messiah to be.
Right. He was supposed to come in and be that king, And whose sermon was it? Was it your sermon that they were saying? They're talking about the gates, where I was fascinated by that. When Jesus came in, he came in the wrong gate. He did not come in the gate that would be for the kings. So it's like that was such a symbol to me that Jesus was not what they were expecting him to be. So then after he's gone, they're all thinking,
Oh, and
who is he?
in that time, there were also people like Jesus, guys going around like Jesus. They were little rebellious individuals trying to, do things. So he wasn't the only one doing that at the time he was alive. But he was the one that had,
The most
all
impact.
got kind of rose above the rest of them.
And there still are some of those out there today.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there are some people that say that Jesus was a follower of John the Baptist. It's like, there's at least some reference to that in the Bible, but
Some already broke with him though.
yeah. Well, John the Baptist died. That could be it.
Oh, I meant before that. In his thinking.
Yes, yes, I think so too. But that gets us back to the question of what did Jesus call himself? Did he call himself the Son of Man? Did he call himself the Son of God, or is that these writers putting those words in his head?
Next week, I'll bring it. I've got a book at home right now, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the book starts off with this description of a person. And if you read that and I ask you who they're talking about, you'd say Jesus,
Okay.
but it's not Jesus.
Uh-huh.
All that it's very closely parallels a lot of things, but it's the concept in the Essene community of who the Messiah is, and they think that person is in their community the teacher of righteousness, which is pretty interesting parallels. But like I said, if you read it without reading the
Is it like language that's in Psalm and Daniel then? Is it like you could read Daniel in that way if you
I'll have to bring it, read it,
okay.
see what you think about it. But anyway, the guy was drawing a parallel between this teacher of righteousness and the Christian belief in Messiah, Jesus as Messiah.
Yeah. Well, and
Yeah,
go
so,
ahead.
no, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, this is why we continue to have Bible study, is that you could make an argument, in context or out of context for both of these viewpoints,
So there are people expecting the Messiah with different ideas than just what the Christian idea or the Jewish idea is. I mean, there are both versions of Judaism, both.
Yeah.
In the early.
Jenny, this reminds me of a little thing that happened when we were all together Easter. As we're trying to figure out our thinking on this, because everybody has a different take. Our little Anderson in the wheelchair, it was his birthday Easter. So David walked by him and said, Anderson, how old are you today? And he said, I'm 27. And so,
27.
I'm 27.
Okay.
So David walked on, never said a word. Somebody else came along and said, Anderson, how old are you today? He says, I'm 14, but don't tell David he thinks I'm 27. And this kind of reminds me.
Oh my gosh, that is hilarious. That is hilarious. Tell David. David believes me.
It's kind
What
of
a funny
where
kid.
we are.
That
Oh, he
is.
So I guess as a kind of your interpretation, was Jesus the fulfillment of prior beliefs that had been misinterpreted, or was Jesus a teacher of righteousness to whom prior beliefs were applied and reinterpreted? It's, no wonder we have 40,000 different denominations of Christianity.
I know.
Very easily could fill that up in a hurry.
Well, and we talked about this a little bit last week. I mean, really, truly, my idea of how the Old Testament, predicted who Jesus was the Messiah, because
Yeah.
Handel took that scripture and made it so real for me that's who I think of Jesus is now.
Well, the other thing is that, just like you said, the versions of the Christianity, the versions of the Bible, if the wording is so important on, something like this, look it up in 10 different versions of the Bible and see how much those 10 versions deviate on the wording.
I can tell you a lot of scholars, this is why my nephew is learning Hebrew and Greek right now, because he wants to go back, and I do applaud him for this. He wants to go back and read it in the original language, and then maybe we'll talk. I would love to ask him this question. I don't think he's gotten that far in his studies.
Talking about modern English versions of the Bible, because the person who does that translates the Greek or the Hebrew into whatever was the common term at the time, but then updates it to, well, what does it mean today? Is it a dude or is it a bloke?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And then you even go, I keep going back to what Amy Jo Levine taught us, where Luke is saying what Jesus said, and then Luke is telling us what Jesus meant.
Yeah, this is what he said, and this is what he
And
meant.
Amy Jill Levine is like, that is not what he meant. Because the parable was very different than the way Luke was explaining it. And then you could see that in Matthew. It's like, oh my gosh. Everybody's an interpreter.
Yes.
Plus,
know?
every one of those writers was Jesus wasn't speaking in Greek,
That's right.
so he was speaking in some of the language. A lot of people say Aramaic.
Yeah, that's what I
But
thought.
He was-
this other guy here, he thinks Jesus was speaking in Hebrew. And so either way, whatever language he was speaking in was translated to Greek.
Right.
Here's her.
And,
Exactly.
and I have
So
heard,
right there,
That's a
there's
lot of
there's one
languages.
iteration. there.
Yeah. Anybody who studied language at all knows that it is not a precise, translation is not precise at all.
you know, and isn't
Translation
it
is
true
hard.
that some of the words have different meaning by just the way you say them or the intonation? And
In some languages.
Yeah.
Chinese is like
Mandarin,
that.
Mandarin
Yeah.
is very much that way. There can be 7 different inflections for a 2-letter word, like, well, 3-letter word. I think it was Mao, M-A-O, like the name of Mao Zedong. But you can say Mao, and those all mean something different, but it's the same 3 letters.
But if, you
Not
know,
to make Chinese any harder.
Yeah,
if some of that is true in Greek or Hebrew or any of those languages, there you've got another twist that you're
Well,
dealing with.
yeah, that's why people are still studying it today. That's why we have all these denominations. That's
So then that brings up the question for some people, inerrancy in the scriptures. You're thinking of translation. I'm like, okay, I haven't thought of that.
Yeah.
I know.
I mean, because every time translation is such a complex process. I mean, it's more than just knowing vocabulary and syntax. You have to understand the culture behind that. So there's a bigger context so that you can pick the best word.
And it's all so foreign to us
Yeah.
in today.
Isn't there who was talking about a Bible that was written from the Jewish perspective? Like a,
Jonathan said.
was that what Jonathan was talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was fascinating to me. So that's somebody going back and thinking in the 1st century Jewish viewpoint and translating it, which I find fascinating. So yeah, I don't mind having unanswered questions. I mean, that's kind of the issue for all of us is you need to make up your own mind of your own viewpoint, your own belief system, but then we can talk about the questions about it. It doesn't have to change our faith. It changes the way we look at our history.
I think a lot of people want the recipe that I can follow
Yeah.
and have a very dogmatic,
Yeah.
clear path.
Yeah.
And
There's
questioning
only one answer.
Is almost
Yeah.
sacrilegious.
Right.
I think sometimes the Bible, people will say the answer is they say that the answer is in the Bible, or the Bible has all the answers. I wonder if a better viewpoint is to say the Bible was asking big questions.
We're
You
still,
make up your own mind. on
We're-
what
But
you
you
yeah,
have
we're
to-
still
the
trying to-
questions are important.
Well,
The answer.
That's how you get groups like the group out of Topeka that, protest everything.
Yeah.
They
They're
have
very
one
dogmatic.
viewpoint.
This is
Yeah.
the only way it is. You deviate from it, you're wrong.
I don't think there's anything wrong with leaving room in your belief system for sacred mystery. It just kind of
Yeah,
enjoying the fact that we can't know everything. We have to accept that.
But they couldn't, the Paulines and Petrines, they were trying to nail it down.
yeah.
Yeah.
It was fascinating to me now that they were trying so hard to figure it out. They were arguing a
Or
lot.
4 centuries later, when they had to come up with these creeds, very precise kind of.
Oh,
All
it's
that
just
led to
typical.
a whole bunch of people. are
Well,
Well,
heretics now.
I mean, and we all kind of want a creed that we can hang our head on, I guess, and say, this is what I believe, but it's probably impossible to develop a creed that you can agree to. Each person can agree to every point.
right.
We might say, well, yeah, I'm okay with number 1, but I don't I don't buy number 2.
Right. The Apostles' Creed doesn't work so well for our religion.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that everybody wants to be right.
Yeah, well, and I looked up just for curiosity on our church website, they have a statement of Christology. I didn't agree with everything that
That's right.
it was in that. I mean, it's, a lot of it's good, but there's places I had questions. Sure,
And the world church recognizes
yeah,
that. They say, you know, here is our sense of who Christ is, but we also understand that people are going to discuss and argue. They didn't tell us that we had to believe everything on their website, which was nice.
argue in a good way.